Hello, my friends. How you doing? Your buddy Phil here. I want to answer a few questions that came in from our friend Shawn today. Shawn says, I have a few questions. Is the management review, project lifecycle, and development lifecycle planning written within the scope management plan / all subsidiary plans within the planning process group? So, the short of it, Shawn, is there's no hard and fast rule regarding this. The bottom line is it should be accounted for in some document. So the management review could be accounted for inside project communications. It could be communicated in other documents such as the project management plan as a whole. Because you do know that when we say project management plan, right, we could be talking about subsidiary plans in the big plan, or we could be talking about special aspects of the plan that are not necessarily subsidiary plans. So you could have a section dedicated to management reviews. You could also have a section dedicated to the project lifecycle. You could also have a section dedicated to the development lifecycle, or you could choose to lump them all into scope management. And you could make that as part of the project scope statement. You could make that as part of a baseline. So you see, there's no hard and fast rule in real life. You see, that is one thing you need to remember. Real life is always different. But for the sake of your exam, I would advise you to just account for each piece as its own separate piece. So when you see management review, just imagine a management review section in your project management plan. Just imagine a project lifecycle description as part of your project management plan. Just imagine the development lifecycle as part of your project management plan. Just think about the change management plan, for example. You could think of that as, okay, it's part of the project management plan, but it's its own separate plan. You get what I'm saying? So for every one of those 19 components on page 89 under project management plan, you got to be thinking about them on their own for your exam. In the real world, things could be very different, all right? But it's not prescriptive in the real world, all right? PMI is also trying to move away from being too prescriptive, but just as a guide, what you do need to remember is there are parts of the project management plan. All right, the little bullet here says if the PM/PMO chooses between the 5 different development lifecycle approaches, what lifecycle group would Sdlc fit in? Very good question. Sdlc would fall under the predictive approach. In fact, they mention it there. It's a waterfall approach. So analysis, design, develop, test, maintenance, or analysis, design, develop, test, implement, whatever the Sdlc is, that will be part of the predictive. Okay? Now you could have some Sdlc allotropes, some Sdlc variants, and those would fall more into a hybridized approach. But for the most part, raw Sdlc fits into plan-driven, fully plan-driven or predictive, all right? All right, another bullet says, I know control accounts in the WBS, usually on level 2 or 3, and so on. And it's where you report most of your cost and all that stuff to management. Well, yes and no. A control account is where management wants greater oversight, greater insight. But that is not to say that you do not report to management at other levels. So the control account is a specific level that management imposes certain types of control and interest. Okay? And then you said, but with bottom-up estimating, do or could you decompose, break down the work into smaller tasks and add up the totals to the root node? Absolutely, that's the whole idea. So the whole idea is this. In budgeting, you're not talking about adding up random tasks, right? The tasks are, of course, linked to one root node, and the tasks are, of course, linked to one control account. So the idea is for you to add up all of the tasks, the cost for all the tasks, And that will lead up to a work package. And the idea is for you to add up all the work packages, and that will lead to a control account. That's the idea. Okay? So when we talk about bottom-up estimating, it has nothing to do with the WBS per se. All right? Instead, bottom-up estimating is estimating. So you need it in estimate cost. You don't use bottom-up estimating, theoretically speaking, in determine budget as a tool and technique. Could you use bottom-up estimating for the entire project? You could. But for the exam, you need to remember, bottom-up estimating is for estimating. It's for estimate cost. It's not for determine budget. For determine budget, you're taking all of the different tasks that you've already estimated and you're aggregating them. That's determine budget. All right. So again, to the question, with bottom-up estimating, could you decompose, break down the work into smaller tasks and add up the totals to the root node? That's the idea, but it's not done in determine budget, you see. And let me explain this. You don't add up to the root node in estimate cost. You add up to the root node in determine budget, you see. But you do not add up the itty-bitty tiny little tasks in determine budget either. Estimate cost is for you to estimate each activity. At worst, each work package. But I prefer saying each activity for exam purposes. So you need to think about each activity. I'm estimating the cost for each activity. That's estimate cost. Or for each work package at worst. And when I say at worst, I mean if you need to go higher levels. But for determine budget, you are not estimating tasks. You are not estimating work packages. You are adding up all of the tasks. See? You're adding up all of the work packages to get the root node number. That's cost aggregation. People often mix up cost aggregation and determine budget. Cost aggregation and bottom-up estimating, I beg your pardon. But they're different, okay? Bottom-up estimating is for estimating. Cost aggregation is not adding up the itty-bitty subtasks. It's adding up the tasks and the work packages, if you get what I mean. I hope that makes sense. Let me know. Okay, for fast recall, I would think of resource optimization as a tool to maximize resource schedules / calendar. So under resource optimization, what do you have? Resource leveling and resource smoothing. So ask the question, can I use those to tighten up the entire project or schedule? Of course you can. But I wouldn't use the word calendar per se. I would use the word schedule. It's really more of a schedule thing. I would use schedule. Okay, that's the language I would use. So your resource optimization is really geared at you tightening up the schedule. The schedule is primary. The calendar is going to follow suit. So the calendar, of course, you've got the resource calendar, you've got the project calendar. So when you do that resource leveling or resource smoothing, it first affects, in your mind, first of all, the resource calendar, ultimately the schedule, ultimately project calendar, you know. And it doesn't need to follow that particular order, but that's how I think of it, okay? Good. The next bullet said, when creating the WBS outline, could you look at components at the second level, above the work package level, as the scope statement? The answer is no. It's important not to confuse the terms. The scope statement is a description. It's not a hierarchy. It's not part of a hierarchy. I like to think about them as their own separate pieces. So when I think about the scope statement, I think of a description of project scope, inclusions and exclusions, deliverable, acceptance criteria, and those items listed in the PMBOK. I like thinking about them as that. It's its own separate document. It's a description. You see, the project scope statement is a description of what you need to do to deliver the requirements. But it's its own man, it's its own woman, it's its own entity, it's its own thing. It's complementary to the WBS, but it's not to be looked at as a level in the WBS. No, because in your project scope statement, you have exclusions. There are no exclusions in the WBS. It's the opposite. The inclusions is what is in the WBS. The exclusions is one of the things in your project scope statement. So it's important you do not mix and meld these unique outputs of define scope and create WBS, okay? Good. So I would look at the project scope statement as a document used to describe the work needed to achieve the requirements described in collect requirements in the requirements traceability matrix and requirements documentation. You see, there's a difference between saying, this is what I need to do this work, versus this is the work, if you get what I mean. So it's important that you understand each one for itself, okay? Now, the work ultimately that you need to do is going to tie into the WBS. You see, this is where the two kind of meet. So you could have described work in your project scope statement, and that work could be found at some levels. It could be found, right? But the bottom line is it needs to lead up to a relevant component or control account or deliverable, if you will. It really depends. But you got to look at them as their own separate thing. All right? All right, the next bullet here says, is schedule model maintenance the act of updating the schedule, i.e. updating the progress of a task in MS project on the left side? It's part of it, but the schedule model, you got to remember what it is. The schedule model is not just the % complete. The schedule model is all of the information and data that resides within the schedule. Resource information, new data coming in, everything. All the moving parts of a project schedule. Resource information, relationships, leads, lags, slack, float, all that great stuff. This is all stuff that you find in your project schedule, you see, and as a result, you know, when we talk about the schedule model, we're not just talking about the project schedule, we're talking about even data that you may not be able to see on the back end, because sometimes that is updated. Leads, lags, slack, float, it's updated. So it goes beyond just % complete, if you get what I mean. All right, good. Could the schedule model be considered the Gantt chart? Absolutely not. The Gantt chart is just one interpretation of some of the data that resides in the project schedule model. So the Gantt chart takes the durations, the length of each task, and some of the associated the relationships and displays them. But the schedule model goes beyond that. It has more information than may be displayed in a typical Gantt chart. And we need to be careful when we say Gantt chart, because what we have in Microsoft Project in many instances is actually a Gantt chart on steroids. Okay? Good. Or is a schedule model really the schedule network diagram? No, the schedule model is all the data, seen and unseen, that resides in and behind the schedule. All that data. So you know what I would recommend for all of these definitions? You got to stick to what the PMBOK guide tells you. Because if you open up the PMBOK guide, they'll give you a rather sterile definition of some of these things. And that's the first definition you want to latch on to. See, that's the first definition you want to hold on tight to. So go to the glossary whenever you're in doubt. I would recommend opening up the glossary, taking a look at what the PMI calls it, the long-winded, sterile definition, and kind of master that first. And after mastering that, you can expand on it within safe limits, if need be. Okay? All right. If a schedule model isn't a Gantt chart or a schedule network diagram or area, where do you update the task and attributes? Then could you provide an example of different types of schedule models that would help me better grasp the concept? Good. So I'm hoping that what I've described will give you a better idea of the schedule model. It is that data. The data that resides. You've got to remember, it's the data that resides in the schedule So if you have worked on a schedule in MS Project, it's the resource information, the start and finish dates, the availability, the leads, the lags, the slack, the float, and all that stuff. And there's a reason why the PMI don't get too much into the weeds in the PMBOK guide. It's because it could be very subjective. But overall, if you have a project schedule and you look at the different views in MS Project, the data that is in all those views, the start dates, the end dates, the finish dates, the actual start, the actual finish, the baseline start, the baseline finish, you get what I'm saying? All that stuff, that's part of the schedule model. So it's the big mass of data. And there are different interpretations of the schedule model. You have milestones. You could filter just to show milestones. You could filter just to show Gantt chart. You could filter just to show one specific resource and their resource histogram for that project. You get what I'm saying? So that's how you need to view what PMI is presenting. I'm also very careful not to give you extraneous stuff that is good for the real world, but when it comes to the exam, it could mar your traction or progress. So I'm kind of careful in putting out stuff that I know may be good for real world, but when it comes to exam, it might have a, double-edged sword, so to speak. All right, so I hope this has been of help to you, and I decided to use a different approach so that I could be more loquacious in my description of what exactly you're asking. Otherwise, I would have to limit my description. I didn't want to limit that for you. All right, so thank you very much, Shawn. All the best in your studying. Good job, and have fun.